We know that sometimes the facts of events are insufficient for us to understand the meaning of events. Today on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Johnathan Druker from Illinois State University joins me in discussing Holocaust literature and how memoirs, diaries, novels, even poetry can help us understand and avoid incomprehensible human actions. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Johnathan Druker from Illinois State University. Dr. Druker teaches Holocaust literature, got his Ph.D. in Italian at the University of California, and has written dozens of articles and chapters, and a recent book, Primo Levi and Humanism After Auschwitz, which we'll want to talk a bit about, and talk a little bit about Primo Levi as well. I think probably the best place to start would be explain to me and our viewers what Holocaust literature as a genre entails.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to talk about this material, which in itself is difficult but rewarding. Of course, the Holocaust is this seminal historical event from the 20th century that we should not forget. And there are plenty of different kinds of historical documents that relate to these events. There's lots of actual documents left behind by the perpetrators. But there's also many forms of documentation that really cross into the literary. And it really starts with diaries that were actually written when people were imprisoned in ghettos. And then it goes on to memoirs that survivors wrote describing the experiences they had. So these are documents that really have a lot of value to historians. They are, in many cases, said to be completely factual, with no sort of literary imagination added to them. But then we quickly come to understand, and I teach Holocaust literature, that really some of the most effective examples of Holocaust literature really do draw upon the sources of literature as well, use the imagination, use metaphor, use all kinds of devices to tell a difficult story. And so when you talk about Holocaust literature as a body, you certainly start with these diaries and survivor memoirs as historical documents. But then what happens is writers who really treat the material respectfully also revisit that same material and use the techniques of fiction as well. And these could be writers who have a personal connection with the Holocaust, but they could also be writers who have no real connection to the events, but have study the events, understand the events to be of huge importance. So Holocaust literature then has that range from the really factual kind of memoir all the way through to novels, even to poetry, where really metaphor seems to be the best way to talk about something that is very difficult to describe.
So Holocaust literature is not just literature that was composed or written by people that were had the experience, but it can be those that may have been born in the last 30 years that are only referencing this material, and they're drawing, as you said, some literary inspiration. That may be a poor choice of words, but to try to explain an event that many say is unexplainable. So
that's right. I mean, there are some definitions of it that are more restrictive. There is a kind of policing of this literature where certainly some scholars and protectors of Holocaust memory are concerned that there's too much fictionalization and that the writers who do that are not faithful enough to history and perhaps not respectful enough of the suffering that the whole literature entails. So there is a bit of an argument sometimes. Is that innovative piece of literature, that novel, is that still Holocaust literature? Or sometimes there's an argument that breaks out that that actually exploits this material in order to write an exciting novel. And I'm sure your viewers know this also about films. Is the film one that respectfully treats the material, or is it bordering on the idea that it's an exciting story?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the policing, it's within the realm of people that both teach and write, there's some disagreement.
Yeah.
I read recently, Elie Wiesel says if you write a novel about Auschwitz, it's not about Auschwitz.
Right.
And I know that you have written about Theodor Adorno, and he said that after Auschwitz you could not write poetry. So both of these are making suggestions that an event that happened that was so traumatic collectively that there's no way to express in an artistic form that? I'm not sure if I was reading,
I think that's right, that there's that sense that the most conservative, safest, respectful approach is to rely upon survivors who can tell a story that they experienced firsthand. And then famously, Adorno did say, you cannot write poetry after Auschwitz. Then over time, he actually softened his position. And so we find there really are a lot of great Holocaust poems. But it's true, there is, particularly in this art form, I would say policing is the right word, is that there are those protectors of Holocaust memory who say that's not properly respectful. And so yes, Elie Wiesel saying, if it's a novel, it can't be about Auschwitz.
Yet he wrote novels.
He did write novels. Really, they're not directly about the Holocaust. Interestingly, when it came to that subject, he did really rely upon the memoir as a form.
Well, one of the things that I noticed that you wrote, I think, I don't remember the full title, The Path in the Pit,
yes.
where you're doing an assessment of Primo Levi. Maybe you should tell us who Primo Levi is before we go too far.
I'll be happy to do that. This is a very apt time to be talking about Primo Levi, since this year is his centenary. He was born in 1919. He was born in the northwest of Italy, in Turin, which is famous for being the town of Fiat, the car, Italian car. But it's also a city of a lot of, we'll say, rigorous intellectual traditions. It's very close to France, being in the northwest of France, very invested in the Enlightenment principles that were inherited from the French. And so it's
and
a city.
Center of trade unionism and a center of socialism, and I know Antonio Gramsci's connection.
Absolutely.
So he's growing up in that environment.
He is, and he will say that after the war, that Primo Levi was certainly someone who was on the left side of the political spectrum, and so certainly that has something to do with being from this town. But briefly, anyway, he would have been about 23 or 4 when he was captured by the fascists. This is a complicated history, with Italy starting on the side of the Axis powers, and then actually becoming a kind of neutral country and also an ally of the West and of the Soviet Union. But in any case, he's captured in late 1943. He's hiding out in the mountains and has taken the role of a partisan, but he really, as he describes it later, he really failed. He was captured after maybe just 3 weeks in the mountains. He ends up revealing to his captors that he is Jewish, and thinking that maybe if he did not admit that he would be taken out to a wall and shot. He has a good explanation then for hiding in the mountains, because now at this time in the late 40s, the Italian fascists are actually rounding up their own Jewish citizens, and with the help of the Germans, are sending them off to camps in Poland, death camps like Auschwitz. And Levi ends up being deported to Auschwitz, spends a little less than a year there, about 11 months, and he is there on January 27th, 1945, which is the day that the Soviet Red Army liberates Auschwitz. And so that is why throughout much of the world, and in Europe, International Holocaust Remembrance Day is always January 27th. So Primo Levi was there. He saw the Russian soldiers arrive. It was a very dramatic scene, which he described at the beginning of his second book. but he wrote then a Holocaust memoir about his time in Auschwitz.
If this is man, is that the translation? If this is man.
I should tell your viewers, yes. Typically, if you go looking for it in the United States, it will be with the title "Survival in Auschwitz." Mm-hmm. A more accurate translation, and now the one that is becoming ascendant in the United States, is "If This Is a Man." And so, certainly for those who wanted to market the book as a Holocaust survivor memoir, they said, our audience doesn't understand it, they won't buy it. But now, really, people know that Levi is famous. He's really right up there with Elie Wiesel as being one of the most authoritative writers about the Holocaust. And so now I think the American market is ready for the more accurate title. And it really does, in some way, describe the philosophical investigation that goes on in the memoir, because he observes people who are reduced to their absolute material essence. They have no spirit left. They have no will left. And so he wonders, are they still men? Do we still owe them an ethical obligation that we owe to all humans? And of course, he does come to the conclusion that, yes, we do owe them that. But so the correct title conveys that philosophical interrogation about what is the prisoner that has had the full measure of what the concentration camps, the death camps, were meant to do.
I'd like to come back to that, but one of the things that you wrote in the essay where you're discussing his novel, I guess it was the novel, not If This Is a Man, but
right.
You made an argument that fiction is the best for history.
Yes.
And it's kind of, you started to bump up against that in the previous thing about describing the literature, but
yes.
why, I mean, that's something that seems, historians might have a problem with that, and others would say, well, that's just a story, but this is what really happened. How can you, how do you present that?
Well, I'm talking in this particular article you're referring to one of the last books that Primo Levi wrote. It really is a fully imagined Holocaust novel, and it's called If Not Now, When? And it's not his experience largely, because it's set in Eastern. Well, and also it's set in Eastern Europe. Okay. And so what he says in the preface is, well, I met a lot of Eastern European Jews in the concentration camps. It's a different culture. It's a culture of Yiddish. It's a more observant Jewish culture. And as I said, he comes from this very enlightened, secular kind of environment. And he was very surprised to meet these Yiddish-speaking Jews who, you know, it's a language that's kind of like an archaic German, but written with Hebrew characters. He could not understand them. But he became fascinated. So many years later, he said, I know I will write the story of a partisan band of Jews from Eastern Europe who end up fighting alongside of the Red Army and end up actually at the end of the war in Germany. From there, what can they do? They have no homes to go to, so they head south, and they actually get to a kind of a sort of a DP camp, a displaced person camp in Italy. And it's from there that they immigrate to Palestine. So this is all in 1945. And that part of the story is true in that Primo Levi had a friend who worked at this displaced persons camp and said, I'm amazed to tell you about these fighters who were rather different from many of the refugees who showed up from Eastern Europe. They really had a kind of fighting spirit. But to go back to your question about this notion of the historical truth in fiction, really my source there, my theoretical support for this idea is the famous Holocaust historian, who for a long time he was at UCLA, he's now since retired, Saul Friedlander, who was also a Holocaust survivor. And he studied this subject for a long time, and I think what he really began to take into account were the effects of trauma, those things that are experienced which really cannot be spoken, they cannot be described, but maybe in art they can be described, if somewhat indirectly. And so I think there he's saying, we historians really need artists and writers to help us fill out a full description of what the Holocaust
Is that
means.
more than, is that beyond just emoting and giving the feeling? Is it also giving a more accurate account, or is the accuracy not the...
I think the historical accuracy is not the issue there. I think it's trying to probe deeper into the ethical, philosophical, and especially the psychological dimensions of the event in order for us to understand what it meant.
So separating, or not separating, but going from what events or statistics might offer to say, what is the meaning of this? Because we could agree on a number of things, but
right.
The meaning isn't necessarily in the actual historical event. It's how people experience and how they relate to it.
Exactly.
So that I think that we would have to say that's true in most events that we're looking at today, not on the level of the Holocaust, but
right. There the stakes are perhaps higher and the story is more difficult to tell, so art perhaps plays an even more important role in this particular history of trauma than in some others.
And this would be more than just for the people that have experienced the trauma, because, I mean, on the one hand, the memoir may be a way of catharsis, or
yes.
Largely there is no catharsis from this event. It's because, as many writers say, it's incomprehensible. I can't find the words. I have to use metaphors. I may use art, but for them, I understand. But what is the importance for those that did not experience the trauma to have access to the memoir in this case, or some other literature reflection on it? What do others get from the traumatic events? In other words, those people that aren't necessarily connected with the Holocaust, or even a generation or two hence, but what would others get from reading that literature?
Well, first, of course, there's this slogan, meaningful, but often used, never again.
Yes.
It's to understand this emotional dimension of the history, to try to access the depths of human suffering, even though you can't really do it. And so that's one reason. But also, I think that writers like Primo Levi and so many others have thought there has to be a lesson here. It's very hard to think that, you know, we died for a reason. So on one hand, there's a resistance to thinking that there was a purpose or a lesson. But in any case, after it's all said and done, this idea that in an exceptional event like the Holocaust, that it perhaps reveals so much about our human condition and about history and about large historical forces. So read as much history as you can, by all means, but also these very excellent examples of art, of film, of poetry, of literature take us into a subject that we really want to know more about. We really want to understand what it means.
Well, there's some ambiguity, I think, around even the slogan that you just used,
yes.
Never again, because then the question becomes, either a memoir and history, well, what were the causes that lead up to this? Because
yes.
if you don't want something to happen again, you have to have some indication of what was the sources of this. So,
yes.
I mean, maybe a really coarse question is, are Germans inherently anti-Semitic?
Right.
Is that
yes.
one lesson? So, I mean,
well,
Ashkenazi Jews
yes.
have to leave because why? Germans are the way they are, or was there a period where Germans in their totality weren't necessarily, or if they acquiesce and become that way, what are the elements? I mean, even to today's contemporary politics, there's suggestions that there's elements that may have been here and there which are supposed to alert us to the possibilities
right.
of, again.
I mean, these are big questions, no easy answers, but someone like Primo Levi is such an interesting and important writer because not only does he document his own experience, but he also spends decades thinking about the Holocaust. And so he wrote, for example, a collection of essays published 40 years after he survived the camp. It's called The Drowned and the Saved. So I would recommend to your viewers to turn to a book like that, to hear what Levi thinks about why the Holocaust happened. I think that he has both a rigorous and a generous side. The rigorous side is that he wants to say that even if you are operating inside of a giant bureaucratic machine, or even if you're one citizen in a large country like Nazi Germany, you still have your own ethical decisions that you make every day.
He was faced with that while he was a prisoner, yes?
Yes, he was.
I mean, that was part of his dilemma, because he was seeing others that were selected
Yes.
for extermination, his
Yes.
word, but he was able to avoid that. I mean, I think there was some guilt
Absolutely.
associated with him, so
Absolutely. I mean, these are not unrelated in the sense that one of the essays in this book, The Drowned and the Saved, is called The Gray Zone, and it's really a meditation on that, where he says, unfortunately, the concentration camp is actually similar to life in general, but just much more extreme, in the sense that we are all under the coercion of power. And so we have sometimes limited spaces where we can have individual freedom and choice, but we also have to recognize that we are sometimes under the effects of power, and so that's why we can't judge, for example, the prisoners in the concentration camp who did things in order to survive, or on the other hand, yes, we can judge them if they did something really egregious. But if, for example, Primo Levi found some water at a construction site and shared it with a friend, but then a third friend, all three of them survived by good fortune, and the third friend comes up a couple of years later and says, you shared the water with so-and-so, but not with me, and I really have a hard time forgiving you for that. And Primo Levi has to look at himself and say, the situation was difficult, but yes, I do feel guilty. So there is that. But just to return to your question about, is there something inherently wrong with German culture? I think that Primo Levi would be one of these people who says, look, we have to have the global context. There was even more anti-Semitism in France in the late 30s than there was in Germany. And that really what it's about, yes, there's hatred of the other, there's xenophobia, but there's also unfortunately, dangers of science. There's the dangers of eugenics, of Nazi racial theory. It's really white supremacy, just in a scientific guise. So as we know, that's a problem that's with us to this very day.
Well, I mean, defending Levi, I would suggest that it wasn't science per se, but it was the use of science for political or economic means, right? I mean, we can't talk badly about automobiles. Well, I guess we could with climate change, but
yes.
We could talk badly about Ford and General Motors supplying tanks and trucks to Nazi Germany for a profit. So,
right. And technology always exists
yes.
in a cultural, historical context.
Yes.
So yes, while we can appreciate all the good things that technology has brought us, we have to recognize how many times science has been used in ways that later on we thought it wasn't actually dispassionate and objective. It was actually part of a prejudice. So we should be alert to that happening. I think the Holocaust is an important lesson of that.
I don't know if it was in Levi or some other reading that talked about psychic numbing under these conditions. How you are as a human becomes numbed, and you may not recognize the world in which you live, and the choices that you make cannot be understood on the level of human, but only on the level of animal, which becomes a question of survival. But that leads me to a final question, which we probably have about a minute and a half.
Oh, okay.
Which is a big question, because in your book about Primo Levi, you said something that about enlightenment, which Levi is a defender of and is hopeful for. You suggested that enlightenment includes, this may be not an accurate quote,
right,
inevitability of fascism, or embedded within it. Is this what you're talking about when you're saying the misuse of technology, or are you talking about something more deeper?
It's related, and it's a complicated question, but it is the provocative thesis of my book on Primo Levi. He was such a defender of the Enlightenment and of rationality, and I just took it as my task to point out that, using Adorno and other theorists, that we could also say the Enlightenment is an incomplete project, and that rationality can be used in ways that are harmful. And Primo Levi slowly, I think, comes to that conclusion, and in fact ends up writing a lot of science fiction stories where he investigates that very question. I would like to read one of Primo Levi's most important poems. You who live secure in your warm houses, who return at evening to find hot food and friendly faces, consider whether this is a man who labors in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or a no. Consider whether this is a woman without hair or name, with no more strength to remember, eyes empty and womb cold as a frog in winter. Consider that this has been. I commend these words to you, engrave them on your hearts when you are at your home, when you are walking on your way, when you go to bed, when you rise. Repeat them to your children, or may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, your offspring avert their faces from you.
Well, thank you. We could obviously have a discussion for much longer, but the time on Roundtable Perspective leaves us quite quickly. But thank you, Dr. Druker, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Maybe we can invite you back. That's all the time we have on our program. Thanks, Dr. Druker, for joining me on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.